everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and today I would like to revisit the origin story. Primarily I'm going to talk about superheroes and the superhero origin story, but I also want to talk about the idea of the origin in a story, and what exactly that means, what exactly we're talking about. Because you'll hear directors and producers bandy around this word even when we're not talking about superhero stuff, and I think a lot of that is because of how big the superhero genre has gotten. So we think about the superhero origin story and whether we want to see how the ball got rolling or we want to just get dropped in a status quo, and fans, complain and talk about the origin and whether or not we should ever do origin quite a bit. But it's also because of prequels, because origin feels like a safe bet for Hollywood. I still don't understand why that is, because so many prequels have done really poorly and have bad reputations, but Hollywood is still, to this day, very quick to be like, when we reboot something or we go back in time, we need to see the origin of something. We need to see how all this mess began. We've got to make sure that fans understand regarding a reboot or regarding like the first time something is adapted. We've got to make sure that the audience understands our character or understands the mythology and the powers and stuff before we start really telling a story. So very often with something like Green Lantern, we won't really tell a real compelling story. We've got to make the whole thing about how it gets started in the first place and holding the audience's hand and just doing a setup movie in the first place. Sometimes, of course, as I always say, origin is a good idea because there's actually a story there, and sometimes it's stretched beyond credulity for 2 hours because you got to make a whole movie and you got to dupe the audience into thinking that you're actually looking at a story, but in reality you're really just looking at backmatter. Kind of like what I said when I did the rewind on Star Wars Episode 1 on The Phantom Menace, where you were basically watching Star Wars Episode 0. You're basically seeing backmatter for what could have just been the crawl for a Star Wars movie instead of an actual story beginning, middle to end, that regardless of the fact that it happens before stuff and that you know how certain things are going to shake out and end because you know what happens after them. You know certain characters that have to be alive, and certain characters that are going to die. You know that Anakin Skywalker is going to become more machine than man, and you know that Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda can't die. You know exactly where they're going to be later. But that doesn't mean that there's not a story that could be told before all of that. Just because you know some stuff that's going to happen afterwards doesn't mean that you can't still tell a compelling story about a character with that wants something, and to see whether or not they get that thing and what we learn about them or what they learn about themselves. They have an opportunity for change. They can change and grow, or they refuse to change. And of course that can be really interesting too. You don't want to be superficial enough to say, if I know that this character is going to be alive, or I know that this character is going to die, I don't care. Like, stories aren't about, is this person going to die? In fact, much of the time, you don't want to kill off your character in a story that's about them. I'm not saying you can never do that, but when I was in writing school, that was a big no-no. You, generally speaking, weren't supposed to kill off your protagonist, especially if it was like a character piece, if they are the point of view character, because you want to see how that character is affected and changed by their experiences. And if they die at the end, then that's the end of not just the story, but their life. They don't have anywhere else to go. And so, again, I'm not saying that that's never a good idea and that there aren't great stories where the protagonist dies at the end. Sometimes there's nothing left to say with a character. Sometimes a character arc leads to a sacrifice. A big personal epic sacrifice at the end. So, like, there are exceptions to that, and I always took issue with that with my mentors in college that would say that, where I was like, okay, but what about, because we were doing primarily literary fiction and we weren't doing genre fiction, but I would be like, okay, but can it still, I've always said this, can't it be both? Can't you do what you do in a lot of genre fiction and have a character have like an epic sacrifice, and the big thing that they learn is that is that they need to be selfless, and so they die at the end. Like, can't you do that? I mean, it can be a cliche. You can do it too often, but like, can't you do that? Why are we never doing that? But there were some sort of hard and fast rules that I realized weren't actually hard and fast, but it was just a matter of beginning writers are not as likely to be able to pull that off, which was, I think, the main reason that my professors in college were telling me that. But anyway, so back to the origin, and specifically the superhero origin. When Kevin Feige was, when Paul Feig was talking about his Ghostbusters movie, he kept talking about how interesting it was to do a Ghostbusters origin. And I immediately took issue with that idea, because you could call the original Ghostbusters an origin story, in that they weren't Ghostbusters before, and then they put on suits, and they go out and they fight ghosts, and all these things, as you talk about them without putting them in the proper context, start to sound like a superhero thing, right? I'm also not saying that origin is only a superhero idea, but you'll see what I mean when I get there. So, Ghostbusters, if you put it in that kind of a context, if you put it in that formula, yeah, it looks like an origin story, where you have these four guys that end up putting on costumes, essentially. They're just their work clothes, but they put on uniforms, and they've got weapons, and they go out and they fight ghosts, and at the beginning of the movie, they were just regular guys, and at the end, they sort of look like superheroes, and they're going to continue being Ghostbusters. They're going to continue fighting ghosts. But that movie wasn't an origin story, because it wasn't setting up a serialized or a anthology kind of story. An origin story, in my view, is a story, and it became that, but it didn't start that way, right? A good origin story is a good story, right? If you're just telling a singular story about some characters, it could look like an origin if you kept going, but if it doesn't, it's kind of not really an origin, right? It's just a story. There's a status quo, and then that is broken, and then a character is affected by that break in status quo, and they go through some kind of an arc. And that's what happens in Ghostbusters. In both of those movies, we have these characters who are at a college, and they're doing research, and then they lose their funding, and now they got to do something else. That's your break in status quo, and in starting the business is the story. It's, what if these guys attempted, or these girls attempted to start this business, and is it going to work out? Is anybody going to believe them? Is anybody going to pay them? And what might they learn through this experience? If you keep telling stories after that, now it's an origin. And the cynical Hollywood model now is everything's got to be a franchise. So if we start with one movie, we're hoping to get a bunch more movies. So every first movie is either now going to be an origin story, rather than just a story that we can build on and tell more stories in that universe if we wanna, with this new status quo setup that makes it look like an origin, or we're gonna kind of drop you right in the middle and just go from there. And sometimes we do that. We did that with Spider-Man, with the most recent reboot in the MCU, but that was because we did Origin twice, and we were afraid people would cry foul if we tried it a third time. And so, as I've said a bunch of times, we went too far the other way with that, where now we don't know enough about Spider-Man's origin. I don't need to see it happen on screen, but I'd like to know what happened. I'd like to know for sure if there's an Uncle Ben and if he died. As I've said, there must have been, because his initials seem to be on Peter Parker's luggage in Far From Home, but that's just an Easter egg. That's just throwing the fans a little bit of a bone if you happen to see it, and a lot of people didn't notice it. We don't even know where that character comes from, and there is a story there. I don't mean to say that you have to tell it, especially when you've told it a couple times, but within the context of that world, I would like to know where exactly that character came from. And we don't with that. And so we went too far the other way that time. But I feel like sometimes we oversimplify things and we get into this rut where we say, oh no, a superhero origin story again. And early on in Superhero Rewind, I was a lot more down on the superhero origin story, because we had a lot of bad ones. And because when I started, we had just gotten out of what I call the growing pains period of superhero movies during the mid-2000s, which I used to call the onslaught because we were getting so many more of them than we were before. And I could have never imagined the renaissance that we would get after that, and that superhero movies would become most of Hollywood's take, and that we would get to this place now where you can't walk 5 feet without a superhero movie. It's like, it's a lot of what we're making now. And so you have a big variety of stuff now. You have good origins, you have bad origins, you have everything in between. You have stories that didn't need to be told, and you have stories that should have been told that weren't. And so it's a case-by-case basis. As I always say, you can make anything work, you just gotta make it work. I think Fantastic Four, you can do an origin story, but I don't think you need to. That, in the comics, is kind of just a thing that gets the ball rolling. It's not like Batman or Spider-Man where there is a full beginning, middle, and end story that's kind of given to you, that you can kind of just adapt. Like, in the comics, it is that way. Those are both pretty short stories, but, well, and Batman's, I guess, a horse of a different color because that whole story had never really totally been told even before we got to Batman Begins. So that was kind of interesting because it felt like there was this big piece missing where, like, we know he goes off and trains, but what is the character arc that gets him to Batman? So, I mean, that's why Batman Begins for me is still the definitive origin story, because not only was there a story there to tell, but it's an original story. We didn't really have that yet. There wasn't, there was stuff to draw from in the comics, but that whole story had not really been told before. And Spider-Man's had. Superman's kind of had. These are all characters that you can see a clear beginning, middle, and end, where you have a character that is in one place, and then they decide to become a superhero, and then, for whatever reason, and then at the end, they are changed. They are not exactly the same as they were before. There was a break in status quo, there was something they wanted, they attempted to get it, and now they're a superhero. And after that, you have to tell different kinds of stories about that character within the status quo that you set up with that origin. But there are other things, again, like Fantastic Four, that I think you could create a good origin story out of, but it's not immediately there for you on paper. With Fantastic Four, it's just, you've got these characters, this family and a friend that go out into space, and they end up getting hit with cosmic rays, and they wind up with horrifying new powers, and then they are kind of freaked out for a minute, and then they realize that they're okay, except Ben Grimm has more of a tragic thing than the other characters, and they come back to Earth, and then they become superheroes, and you go. There's not an inherent story in the getting of the powers, but there are clear stories that almost immediately write themselves when they get back. And so it's sort of like the Hulk thing. Like, you can maybe make that its own story, where you have an entire story about Bruce Banner where he has the hubris of experimenting on himself and thinks he's going to be okay, and then that's how he pays for it, and then he learns something from that. There is maybe a story there, and you could also just make that his backstory, and where he's beginning to pay for it. Now that's, you know, you've already had your break in status quo. You can kind of drop us right in the middle of it. So there aren't too many things where I would say that there's definitely no story to be told. Some are easier than others to actually make a real story out of an origin. I just think that sometimes we say origin story when we really mean backmatter. Like, we throw the word story around too loosely. Like, story means something. There has to be a character arc to have a story. There has to be a beginning, middle, and end. There has to be a break in status quo. There has to be an opportunity for change, even if the character doesn't take that opportunity for change. There has to be a resolution to the story. A story is not some stuff that happens in the past that informs the character. So Bruce Wayne's parents' death that night by itself is not a story. It is part of Bruce Wayne's origin. He does change from that experience, but there's not an opportunity for change. It's a kid who watched his parents die. That's that's a first act plot point before it's anything. It's not a whole story. And so sometimes I think we'll make movies that are just backmatter, and we'll kind of try to fudge it and try to force it into the we'll try to force it into the formula of an origin story, but in fact it's not really a story, it's just an origin. And so I think it's important to know the difference between those two things, backmatter and an origin story, and I think it's also important to understand that the first time you deal with a character doesn't make that their origin story, or that, like, if you have a singular movie or a singular story about a character, it's not an origin story. It can retroactively look like one if you start building on it. So, like, if you made another Field of Dreams, and that's a bad idea, that's the first Field of Dreams is not Ray Kinsella's origin story. It's a story about a guy who needed to reconnect with his father, even though his father was deceased. There's a character arc there. There's a story there. If you had some kind of weird status quo after that, where he keeps the baseball field and people keep coming to watch the baseball games, and you tell some kind of stories, you have some kind of, like, really awful sitcom, like, set in the baseball diamond, then yeah, I guess that for that series is in origin. But I think the reason that we think so much about the origin story, that's become such a, like, ubiquitous phrase in Hollywood, is because of serialized fiction, or even, like, stagnant episodic fiction, where you have the initial setup for a character and then you just keep telling stories about that character. That's just not how every story is done. That's how we do most things now, because we want to bank on franchises, and we want to, your franchises are more safe bets if you can keep them around, if you can keep people coming to the same thing as opposed to trying something new every time. But not everything is made for that format, and we try it too much with stuff that's not really made for that. But also, if you have a story that is serialized and just lengthy, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, the first time you meet that character, it's not necessarily an origin story, it might just be the first act. Like, the first episode, or the first few episodes of Breaking Bad, I wouldn't call that Walter White's origin story. I would call that whole series a story, If you have to put it in the origin terms, there are origins for different things that happen to him, right? Like once you have, like, little sections that you can kind of plug in and see, like, an opportunity for change, and then there's, like, sort of a mini story inside of the larger story. Yeah, I guess there's origins for different things. Like, there's the origin for Walter White becoming a criminal, where, like, he's past the point of no return, he's not going to go back on that. You have I guess an origin is just a new status quo, right? Like, that's really what I'm trying to get at here. And like I said, not all of those make sense to try to attempt to make an entire story out of. Just because you break a status quo doesn't mean you told a story. That's just the beginning of a story, and I think sometimes we kind of convolute those things. So that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Leave your comments and let me know what you think about the hypothesis that I kind of threw out at you here, and do you think we're still doing, especially in superhero origins, too often? Do you think that, like we did with Spider-Man, if we've told the origin before, we need to knock it off and stay away from it? Do you think that I'm right and that MCU Spider-Man went too far in not telling us anything about that at all? Or is it okay to just make that assumption of more or less how the Uncle Ben thing happened, even if we never mention Uncle Ben, just because this is a character that we know already? Or each time we start over, do we need all the elements of a story to give it its own internal logic and to make it a full story? It gets complicated when you reboot. It gets complicated when you're dealing with characters that people have heard of before and know things about. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Sure appreciate it, and I'll see you again with another video not too long from now. Thanks, everybody.